Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Thought Level Podcast. My name is Laura Swanson, and I have my master's degree in social work. I also have my bachelor's in social work. I'm currently working in outpatient mental health as a psychotherapist. On the podcast today, we're going to talk about imposter syndrome and what it's like to operate with that feeling when you work in the social work and mental health fields. I also want to preface this podcast by saying I have a fan going, so if there is some noise disturbance, I apologize for that. It's very hot and I do not have an air conditioner in my room where I'm recording this. So, fun facts. So first, let's break down what imposter syndrome is and what that looks like. So the American Psychological Association states imposter syndrome as that feeling of being a fraud, that questioning yourself as to whether or not you are prepared to succeed, if you're able to do the work well. Many times, there are a lot of grad students that feel that imposter syndrome, and it can occur when you're starting a new chapter in your life or a new experience. An important note as well is to consider intersectionality. Including socioeconomic status, racial identity, gender identity, all of those things come into play and can be incredibly influential factors on who experiences imposter syndrome the most and what that looks like. You look at race and how many people of color, Black girls, that particular section, right? How Black women are constantly ignored, honestly, or told that they're not able to do this job or not able to do this or not able to succeed or become this or that. And that kind of becomes internalized and could look like imposter syndrome in the future. So taking into account intersectionality is also incredibly important. Many people who experience imposter syndrome have thoughts, including, I have no idea what I'm doing, they're going to find out I'm terrible at this job and fire me, I'm not qualified to do this, I'm going to be a failure, I don't understand how I got here, I don't deserve this. I do believe there is a balance in understanding and checking your privilege, and also accepting that you are not an imposter and can do well. So self-assessment is very important. However, there are some genuine cases of people truly being unqualified for the work or landing somewhere because of a well-connected family member or coming from a wealthy background. And so it's important that you do recognize your privilege, right? Understand what privilege looks like and differentiate that from imposter syndrome. So again, there is a balance to strike. Typically with imposter syndrome, it is people who they've put in the work, they are very qualified, they have a reason and a solid reason for being there because they have skill, they have education, they have all those qualifications, yet despite all those things, those thoughts of not being good enough or not knowing what they're doing or being a fraud persist. So I think that's an important aspect to distinguish. My personal experience with imposter syndrome first started in my undergraduate education in my bachelor's of social work. My internship in undergrad was at a child advocacy center, and there we worked with children who were severely physically abused and also sexually abused, and also, child fatalities, things like that, usually as a result of maltreatment and abuse. And I never had really experienced imposter syndrome before, and it wasn't until I got into that work that it really hit me. I'd go in and I was so passionate about the work that we were doing there and being an intern there. All of the feedback I got from my supervisor was extremely positive. I had a 4.0. All of the evidence in my life pointed to the fact that I knew what I was doing really well, I was doing well at this work. So even though that evidence was there, right, and I had received positive feedback from many different people, that feeling of being a fraud, and I remember walking to the office, and there would be some times where I'd be like, today's gonna be the day, that my supervisor comes to me and just tells me this whole string of mistakes and terrible things that I've done, or mistakes that I've made, and how she finally sees through me, and which was so wild that my brain went there. because all the evidence pointed to the fact that I was being effective and I was skilled in this work. I couldn't shake that feeling. And that's when I really first had my experience with imposter syndrome. I think now looking back, I most often feel imposter syndrome, and I'm most often triggered when it's something I'm incredibly passionate about. And I think in some respect it's normal, right? Because it is a new season of life, especially when you start a new thing that you're extremely passionate about. But I also think, if it's something that you feel is your life's calling, that you're doing this work and it just brings you the most absolute amazing joy in the whole entire world, having that fear of failure makes it all the more worse, right? I actually, when I first started in college, I started at community college, and I started as a nursing major. And I remember being a nursing major, and let me tell you, there was no imposter syndrome there. That was just straight up, I didn't have skill. I didn't like nursing. I was looking for any way out. And I think that's honestly why I didn't do well in those classes, because I didn't care. I didn't have the passion. I didn't put in the work. I didn't study. And that was reflective in the work that I did. But then once I changed my major to human services and I got my associates in human services, it was during those classes and, then into further undergrad as I transferred to a 4-year university. That's when I started to feel imposter syndrome, is when the things that I loved the most, the work that I loved, the things I was most passionate about, those came into my life, and those were the things I was actively participating in. And so it almost seemed like it was more to lose. With nursing, I didn't care if I failed because it wasn't something I cared about. But with social work and being a therapist, because it is something I am so deeply passionate about, that fear of failure is all the more daunting, because it's not only failing as a social worker, but failing at your life's calling and what your deepest passion is. And that was absolutely terrifying to me. So, moving on from my personal experience, I also feel like there's a compounded effect when working in social work and therapy because of that fear of messing up. And I think this is why it's so different and kind of niche in social work and therapy, is because the work that we do is so important. So in some sense, you don't want to mess up, right? Because if we do mess up, it could be really bad for our clients. If I mean, and obviously it depends on the scale to which that happens, but you see the stories of the CPS workers, which I'm sure that's a thing we'll talk about later on, is how the media always just perpetuates that negative stereotypical CPS image and labels it as social workers everywhere. But anyways, that's another tangent. We have that fear of failure and fear of messing up because the work that we do is so important. And the people that we work with, the families, the communities, the legislation, all of the social work that we work on are vital, not just for anything, but for human life and for quality of life. And I think a lot of social workers are very obviously empathetic individuals, which is necessary in the field, but it's also because of that empathy that we put so much more pressure on ourselves, because we know the work is important. We know the work is impactful, and that if we do mess up, it could have negative consequences. Because in social work, like I know for doctors, the rule is, right, do no harm. But in social work, it's beyond that. It's not just do no harm. We must also do good work. We must also be effective. It's not just not hurting them, but being a support, being helpful, using our skill, using our education. And I think a huge part of social work is because of our empathy, because it's something that many people are so passionate about. There is all the more to lose. And we know what could happen if we do fail. We know the domino effect. We know the impact of what that would look like on the many vulnerable people that we work with and serve. So it's a terrible feeling to have and to navigate as a social worker and as a therapist. Imposter syndrome. How can we cope with that feeling when we are doing important work, when we know the impact of our work, and when we know the impact of if we don't do the work well? And I think something that has come up for me recently is now working with clients that are extremely high risk. Working with clients of mine in therapy that are very high risk for harming themselves, or harming other people, who are also experiencing psychosis, who are currently not on medication, who are also on top of that experiencing homelessness, and it's just very compounded stuff. And I had supervision the other day, and we were really hashing out just this one client in particular, and there just felt to be so much pressure. Obviously there should be, because this person's life is important, and I want to be a support and a resource to them no matter what, to help them get through this phase of life and achieve the goals that they have for themselves. And so to me, it was just whew, this is heavy. I'm literally their number one cheerleader. I want the absolute best for them. I want them to succeed. I just want to just get them there. I want to get them to the finish line. But the weight of failing was always in the back of my mind, because they were late to their session. And my first thought was, oh my gosh, the worst has happened. They've self-harmed, or they've hurt someone else, or they've hurt themselves in a more serious way. And so I texted them, I called them, and I got so scared, honestly. And we had a safety panel in place. We had all of those things in place. We've talked about it at length and all those things. But I knew the weight of what would happen if, I don't know, the alternative situation occurred, because obviously we can't always look on the bright side, especially in mental health, when we deal with people who have so much going on, who are very complex. And so recently, imposter syndrome has been hitting me more in terms of, am I even able to serve this client in the way that they need? I'm fresh out of grad school. I feel like they need a clinician who's had 40 years of experience specifically when working with all of this, and it was just a lot. And there was a lot of self-doubt that I had, and it wasn't until I kind of took a step back and reflected on that I was able to navigate my own thinking patterns and that own process for me. So what are some things that as social workers and therapists we can do to work through and overcome that imposter syndrome? One thing that we always repeat as social workers is to treat the root, right? Go to the root, not the symptom. And I think that is an important thing to remember, is that imposter syndrome is not the root problem. It is merely a symptom of something underlying that is going on with you. So in a sense in this, you got to do some therapy on yourself, or you could just go to therapy too. That I recommend. If you haven't heard any of my other podcasts before, go to therapy. It's amazing. It doesn't matter if you're a therapist. It doesn't matter if you're a social worker. If anything, you need it more. So go. But I think a lot of what treatment looks like for imposter syndrome, there's not a lot of research out there. But what is out there, and I've provided the references in the description of wherever you're listening to this, is you kind of have to do cognitive behavior therapy on yourself, right? Which is cool because CBT is it functions that way, where you can kind of just take it home with you and practice it yourself. But imposter syndrome is a symptom of a deeper problem going on, of some deeper emotions and thoughts that you have of yourself. And so you need to reflect. And I think a huge part of this is self-reflection, right? And if you are struggling in that area of self-reflection, or even in processing what that looks like, that's why I recommend therapy. What factors have led you to feel that way? What factors have led you to feel that you're unable to do this, or that you're a fraud, that you're not capable of doing this work? Have your successes been minimized in the past? You're experiencing low self-esteem. Has there been too much criticism given to you? Are you striving for perfectionism? Something that is not able to be obtained, so it's just constant failure? It's important to understand, what is the reason behind all of this? What is the reason behind the imposter syndrome? I know we're talking a lot about myself today, but I have experienced imposter syndrome. And it is something ongoing, right, that sometimes comes up a little bit more depending on the day. But I think for me, something that I dealt with was perfectionism, right? Which was something, I was striving for something that could not be attained, ever. And it's a tiring race to run, knowing that you will never get to the finish line, but you keep on trying, and you keep on fighting for it, and you keep on running. And you tell yourself, I'm almost there, I'm almost there, I'm almost there, but you never actually reach the finish line because it's not possible. Because perfection is a myth, and honestly subjective. So that's something that really perpetuated that feeling of being an imposter for myself, is having those standards for myself and never allowing myself mistakes, which eventually I got more comfortable with over time, because as a social worker, especially as a student, I realized it's better I make the mistake now as a student in an internship, because I'm learning, because I don't have a license to lose, because I'm an intern being supervised. I can ask questions, I can mess up within reason, obviously. I don't have a license to lose, basically. That's what I'm saying. Now, if I mess up, there are consequences to that. So particularly if you're a student and you have that opportunity right now, it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to have to edit your practice or have to ask questions, or honestly, it's okay to walk in and just not know how to do something. That's okay. It's important that you tell yourself that. Part of cognitive behavior therapy is, probably all of you know, since if you're listening, you're probably a social worker or a therapist, is looking at those automatic thoughts and using cognitive restructuring and reframing to practice making those thoughts more positive, more helpful, more realistic, in whatever way that looks. I think a huge part of that is looking for the evidence. Because I looked at the evidence, and logically, when I looked at a situation, you would end with the conclusion that, oh, I'm qualified, I know what I'm doing, I'm capable of handling this. But it was something else in my mind that just went straight to, nope, no way, girl, you cannot do that. I don't want to say for no reason, obviously. There were deeper things going on that led to that feeling of imposter syndrome. But when you look at the logical evidence in front of you, it was kind of like, I look at this, and I look at this, and I look at this, and, it appears as though I am qualified and capable. Interesting. So it's important to have those things in mind. And I think, we know what cognitive distortions are. We know what those negative thinking patterns look like. So look at the evidence, challenge those negative thinking patterns. And even more than that, repeat to yourself new ways of thinking that are more helpful, more realistic. Perfectionism is not the goal, because as we say in social work, goals should be realistic and attainable, and perfectionism is a subjective myth that is impossible to ever obtain. Part of that is to use positive affirmations and repeat them to yourself. And this has been really helpful for me, and something that I always tell my clients too, outside of imposter syndrome. It's just important to create that routine for yourself. Whether that is looking in the mirror, which I have slowly become more comfortable with. Before it was, it made me cringe having to look in the mirror and say positive affirmations. But it's been so helpful. And it's kind of one of those things, the way I explain it to clients, it's kind of one of those things where, you repeat it enough, one of these days, you're actually going to believe it. It's kind of one of those things you just got to tell yourself. And it's just going to click sometime. It's just going to sink in finally. Embrace the doubt, the uncertainty, and the change. I think a huge part of social work and therapy is, like I said before, knowing the impact that we have, right? Knowing what can happen if we don't do our job well. I think it's incredibly important for social workers and therapists to know that growth is necessary. And many times we grow by making mistakes and by having to revise our practice. We don't just be perfect ever, right? Because it's not possible. We are human. We are not immune to the waves of life. So embracing whatever uncertainty you're feeling and going with that. Go with that feeling. There have been some sessions where beforehand I'm just like, I don't even know. I don't even know. I don't even know. I don't even know where to start with this person. I don't even know what today's going to look like. I'm not even sure if I can deal with this. Or, respond on I don't know if I can be a good therapist today. I don't know if I can actually say therapist things. I don't know. And then I'd go into that session. I'd have to embrace that uncertainty. And I did. I embraced it fully. And the session was great. Because it was less about the fear of not knowing what to do this session and more about just embracing the moment, right? And truly being present with the client, because that's where they needed me to be. Developing a new normal and also understanding what situations make you feel this way. And I think a lot of that goes back to changing your automatic thinking patterns and also understanding the cause, because imposter syndrome is a symptom and not the problem. When you know what situations make you feel that way, it can be easier to understand, okay, so this is what's going on here. This is why I'm starting to feel this way. This is something I say probably in every podcast. Go to supervision. Speak to a supervisor. If apparently your supervisor is not speaking to you or is too busy or supervision is a little wonky, consult with a coworker or another professional. Connect with someone who's also experiencing that. Also, the internet is wild. There are internet support groups everywhere. Especially now in the age of teletherapy and Zoom conferences. There are resources out there, there are support groups, and there are many people dealing with imposter syndrome. So definitely get support and talk to your supervisor about it. Validate those doubts and fears that you have, because it comes from a real place. You don't just feel those feelings because, there's a reason behind that feeling. There's likely an experience or multiple behind that feeling. So it's important that you validate it, because it's okay to feel that way. It's okay to experience fear and doubt. And you need to acknowledge it and validate that. And until we do that, then we can go into addressing it and addressing that fear of failure and diving into what that looks like. Like I said earlier, there hasn't been a lot of research on what treatment for imposter syndrome looks like. There's not a lot of research about imposter syndrome. But there was a 1985 paper by Matthew and Clance, who I've provided the resource below, or wherever you're listening to this on. And one of the things that they said was cognitive behavior therapy, but also group therapy. On top of that, not just individual therapy, but coming alongside others who are also struggling, garnering that support. Because a huge part of imposter syndrome is also that feeling that you're the only one who's experiencing it. That feeling of isolation. I certainly got that feeling when I started grad school. I started at Columbia, which was an Ivy League school. And it was my dream. It was my dream school. It was my number one school. And I still to this day am in shock that I went there. And I'm still kind of navigating those imposter syndrome feelings post-graduation. But something that always surprised me was when other students spoke about imposter syndrome, because I never realized that they also had that feeling and had those fears and just, felt like a fraud. And I remember the first time a peer of mine talked about it in class, and I looked at her and I'm just like, what? Like, you get it? Like, you think that way too? Like, you have that feeling too? And it validated my experience so much to know that I was not alone in that. So I definitely understand why group therapy can be effective, and is beneficial. And also CBT, as we've seen in all of these suggestions so far. The last suggestion is to indulge yourself. Indulge yourself. I think a huge part of this suggestion is, particularly if your imposter syndrome stems from a place of the need for perfectionism. And I think that's something that I relate to very heavily. When I was an undergrad, I was incredibly busy. I worked at a group home as a direct support professional for a lot, like almost 80 hours a week, and it was always like third shifts and then double shifts on the weekend because that was the only time I could work, and then I would have my internship on top of that. A lot of the times I'd work double shifts Saturday and Sunday, and then Sunday night I'd do third shift, and I'd get done with third shift at like 8:30 in the morning. And so leaving work at 8:30 in the morning, I'd get dressed, I'd get coffee, and then I'd clock in at my internship from 9 to 5. And then a lot of times from there, I'd have to drive to like a night class, or I'd drive home, or I'd have to drive to campus anyways for a meeting, because I was also on the board for 3 or 4 clubs and honor societies and organizations. I was also volunteering part-time. I was on call with the Red Cross, and I just had a lot. I had a lot on my plate, and it came from that place of perfectionism, of wanting to feel like I could maintain all that crazy, right? And it wasn't working. On weekends, if I wasn't doing something, or if I didn't have like an event or something like that was social work, volunteer, whatever related, I felt like a failure. And it took a long time for me to accept that self-care is not failing, that taking a break and doing something that you enjoy outside of social work is not failing. That took me ages, and honestly, if I'm being real with myself, it's still something that I'm processing. It took me a very long time to go back to those things that I enjoyed that were not social work or crime related, because I'm also heavily into criminal justice and all that, forensic psychology and all that kind of stuff. And it wasn't until I started indulging myself and making it a regular practice in my life that I could see improvements in my own mental health. If I'm being real, allowing myself to paint, to read books that were not about treatment plans or psychosis or abuse or trauma or being a therapist or social work practice. Just books that were fun, that were fiction. For the first time in a long time, I was able to get that feeling of happiness for things that were not social work related. And I think that's important. Create a life outside of social work. Create a life outside of being a therapist. Whatever that looks like for you. I'm not saying working a lot is bad at all. We all have our own balance. And I think it's important that you assess yourself and understand what works for you and what that balance is. Because some people like a nice even work-life balance. Some people like myself that whatever it's called. What is it called? Scale. The scale is tilted a little bit the other way. And, it's whatever balance works for you, but as long as there's balance in some way, right? This work is hard. You're doing a great job. Social workers are notoriously underpaid and also underappreciated. Give yourself grace, because you are doing the work that is ignored by many, but that people never fail to criticize when given the opportunity. You have skill, compassion, empathy, and you are creating lasting and impactful change in the lives of many people. Many people. Thank you all so much for listening to today's podcast on imposter syndrome and social work and therapy. If you relate to anything we talked about, or you want to share your experience with navigating imposter syndrome, feel free to share in the comments on whatever platform you're listening on. Also, check out my Etsy, Teespring, Instagram, Twitter, Pinterest, Facebook, YouTube at The Thought Bub. On Etsy, I have resources for social workers and therapists for activities, worksheets, wall art for your office, and Teespring is more social work, mental health merch. So like mugs, sweatshirts, t-shirts, fun stuff like that. Also on my Etsy shop, we're doing a Independence Day sale. So it's 10% off everything, all my listings. So check all those things out if you like. Links will be provided. You can also support the Thought Bubble podcast and the Thought Bubble in general by donating to my PayPal account, which is also provided below. Once again, thank you all so much for listening. If you'd like to share your experience with imposter syndrome or anything about the podcast, feel free to comment, feel free to leave your thoughts. I hope to get a great discussion going. So thank you all so much for listening. I look forward to growing with all of you as social workers and therapists and continuing to work in the absolute